AMD's RX460 finds itself in a tricky place in the market, where it's not quite bargain bin territory unless you get a good find, and the RX480 and 580 are so close in price that you may as well buy one of those. But today the question is, how is the RX460 doing, and is it obsolete already?
Right, now a few of you might remember our video from last week or the week before where we bought this cheap, fast gaming PC off eBay for about 20 quid. And it was fairly underwhelming, in no part thanks to the Core 2 Duo it came with. Fortunately it didn't come with Windows Vista Basic, but what it did come with was a rather decent graphics card, which is worth more than this entire system is. So inside here, which fortunately is very easy to get open because it's got no screws holding it together. Nothing to do with me, that's just how they shipped it. We've got our SSD dangling about, but more importantly, we have an RX460 graphics card. One that has seen better days, but it was still very, very, very cheap. So what we're going to do is actually find out how good the RX460 is, because this really didn't give it any opportunity to do anything. So we can whack a lid back on this and then chuck it to one side. I genuinely have very little use for this entire system because it's worthless. It's genuinely worthless. But this tiny little RX460, despite the fact it would have seen better days before it ended up covered in grime and dust and dirt, could actually be a somewhat decent graphics card, and we've never looked at the entry level to Polaris. I mean, I know there's lower end Polaris cards out there than this, but back when it launched, this was the entry level. And I did use them in people's PC builds back in the day. Why? Because it was AMD's new card that you could plonk into any system and play all the games that were out there. So just how is it holding up? We'll whack it in a Ryzen system, because the Core 2 Duo was a terrible idea of pairing it with this graphics card. But they are in a little bit of a weird position in the market, is the RX460. They are certainly struggling to find their footing. I think it's in no small part thanks to the fact that some people think these are worth far more than they actually are, and you can pick up an RX480 or an RX580 for 20 to 30 pounds now. In fact, I've just bought an RX580 for a video, it's untested, but that was about 20 quid. Is it worth getting one of these? I mean, the advantage is they're low power and modern architecture, and they still get drivers. Even then, their drivers are just bug fixes. They aren't anything special anymore, which is even more of the reason to look at it, because I quite liked this card back in the day. I've never tried undervolting them, I've never tried overclocking them, and it does look to be an OEM variant that I've seen sell from anywhere for 15 to 30 pounds. So it could be good value, but really I've still got to test the Core 2 Duo from that system, but that's a story for another day. I do actually really want to do a full revisit on the Core 2 Duo. I said I was done with the Core 2 Duo, but there seems to be a lot of demand from people to do like an hour-long bumper special on that. This will not be an hour-long bumper special because there isn't huge amounts to say about it. We might have to actually take this thing outside and give it a little bit of a clean-up as well. So if we do run into any issues with thermals, we'll take it outside and give it a little bit of a clean. But we're just going to run the AMD drivers. We're not going to go through modded ones just yet. We will probably test those at the end of the video just for stability and see if they are worth it. This is what I mean. You've got three choices of Polaris graphics cards back in the day. 460, 470, 480. Before the rebranding and the overvolting started, this is what you got. It was a good lineup at the time. I really liked Polaris, and it's only now that they're beginning to drop in price we're starting to look at them, because they held their price so bloody well. And in fact, these have held their price better than the others because they've just plateaued at that £25 sort of region. You can get them cheaper, but it won't be buy it now, it'll be auction, so they're in a funky spot in the market. Right, so I've gone through and I've ran DDU just already because we did have some modded Terascale drivers on here. So what we'll do is we'll run through the AMD drivers, put it through a stress test, and I want to get some baseline figures and then see if these things can overclock or undervolt or just get any of the performance benefits you usually get out of a Polaris card, because there's plenty of modern games I want to test on this. I mean, we've got the Oblivion remaster, we've got the most popular titles on Steam out there. There's just lots to test out on the RX460 because, sure, putting it in a Core 2 Duo PC like we saw last week probably wasn't a great idea, but there's plenty of cheap systems, especially right now with Windows 10 losing support. There's so many good systems out there that can still run modern Windows, have good PCIe bandwidth, and can probably support an RX460 completely fine. Right, so drivers are now installed, and then after that's restarted, we can crack on with the rest of the video. We've finally got that all set up and working, which was a lot quicker when we're not using the Core 2 Duo, to be fair. Honestly, Since GCN came out, I've not really had any problems with AMD drivers whatsoever, so RX460, 2 gigs of RAM, so let's get through 3D Mark and then we're sorted, we're done, we're ready, which is nice to see.
Now, after we've got everything all set up and running, usually what we do is run through 3D Mark and just make sure everything is performing as it should, and to get some baseline figures before we begin to overclock. But straight off the bat, running through 3D Mark, other than the card beginning to actually get rather hot now it is actually being utilised in a proper system and beginning to smell slightly of stale cigarettes, well, it did begin to actually pose some issues, because our results that we were getting were slightly lower than average. They just didn't seem to be where they should be. I mean, the card wasn't thermally throttling, it was maintaining its clocks okay, everything about this card should be working okay, and even though it does look to have had a bit of a heavy life before we've got a hold of it, well, it's not exactly showing any signs that it's thermally limited or anything like that, causing us detriment to the performance. So I thought, you know what, maybe we'll take a little look at the clocks and see what's going on here. And it does look like these HP OEM units, which are incredibly common. If you search for an RX460, chances are you're finding an OEM unit like this, where they really did take advantage of the power side optimizations of Polaris, where they are entirely focused on efficiency. The only thing is, they've gone about it in a bit of a heavy-handed kind of way, where you're running these standard voltages of an RX460 and just really intensive caps on the clock speed. So it was about time we tried to see if we could resolve this, and even if we couldn't overclock for extra performance, could we at least overclock it back to where it should be? Now, I did try to push things as far as I could with overclocking, and it does seem that the memory on this card is where they've really cut things back, as we could pretty much max out the memory slider in MSI Afterburner to try and bring back as much performance as we wanted. It's worth noting I did try and do a little bit of overclocking first using the AMD utilities, but it seems that they are much better suited for undervolting rather than, of course, overclocking the graphics card. Now, you can do it through the AMD utilities, but I just find the MSI Afterburner side much nicer to work with. And eventually, in no time at all, we did at least have the RX460 in this system, slightly beating the average performance that you'd get from an RX460 off the shelf. So I'd imagine if you had pretty much any variant better than this, you could go even higher than this, but it serves as a good baseline of the performance of an RX460. You can get this performance out of an OEM unit if you choose to actually fix the clock speeds it comes with out of the box, and you'd pretty much be getting this speed if you got any normal RX460. The only thing was, our clock speed wasn't exactly stable, and I do think it was trying to do some thermal controls that are probably built into the BIOS on an OEM unit card like this, and yes, we could go through and set the fan speed to run stupidly high and just have a really noisy graphics card just to keep the clocks where we want them to be, but honestly, something like this that already looks as filthy as it does, chances are it's running the original thermal paste on a graphics card that's nearly 10 years old now, and the only solution to something like that is to take it apart and see what's going on. When it actually came to the condition of the card, after we actually got the fan off, it really is a very basic design. You're talking, it's a fan stuck on a minimal GPU die. In fact, the GPU die on this card is absolutely minuscule, and you can notice the build-up of sort of brown, dark, nicotine-y dust that sort of built itself up onto the VRAM chips, but at the end of the day, that really isn't affecting the temperatures too much. It might be slightly disgusting, but it's not affecting the thermals. The only thing that was affecting the thermals was the fact that the thermal paste had completely dried out, which does surprise me a little bit, but then again, in my head Polaris is still relatively new, and let's be honest, it actually isn't, so it could actually use a repaste. So we took the card outside, gave it a quick spray down, cleaned it all up, made sure the fan was completely free of dust, it wasn't doing anything to thermals, but at least it didn't look as disgusting anymore, and there we had it. The RX460 was now completely working fine, without any throttling problems. Hurrah! With that all cleaned up at last though, what I ended up doing was running it through 3D Mark's Time Spy again, and what we found out was that with a baseline result we saw 1501, with an overclocked result and the card being manky and dirty, we saw 1625, which was primarily brought down by the boost clocks not actually remaining in function, so it would just fluctuate all over the place rather than going up to where it was actually meant to be overclocked, and then finally with the overclocked and cleaned results we saw 1651. It's not particularly exciting, exciting result, but it just lets us know that the card is now stable and is actually in line with how an RX460 should perform. Really, you are not going to be seeing anything spectacular in terms of performance from this overclock because it's purely bringing it in line with where it already should be. The core clocks on this card wouldn't like to go much higher without pumping in too much voltage, and then you end up in the cycle of too much heat, can't get rid of the heat, need more voltage to up the clocks, it won't stay stable, blah 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 blah. It just becomes a long convoluted circle where with a card like this, without the ample sort of cooling it really needs, you're best off just putting it back up to its stock clocks and where it should be, and then giving the card a good clean. Now, there isn't much point boring you with the specifications of the RX460 because it is exactly what it says on the tin. It was the entry level to Polaris as a cheap graphics card that you could simply go out and buy when it released and stick into any system. It uses 75 watts under full load, but it's very rare you'll come across an RX460 that will be utilizing all 75 watts. Most of them tend to be far more power efficient than this, and with undervolting, they become even more power efficient than they are out of the box. They came out in 2016 being based on, as I said, Polaris being the Baffin Pro variant, and there isn't really too much exciting in terms of specs other than that. 896 shading units, 56 TMUs, 16 ROPs, and it supports DirectX 12 to the latest level, so you won't have any issues launching modern games, but you might be lacking the raw physical horsepower to do so, and it does also support Vulkan. Most variants you see out there will fortunately not require a 6-pin, which is another point of convenience for being able to whack it in any system. They've got AMD VCE support, and that really is all there is to these graphics cards. They are a Polaris card to work in any system with the cut down specifications to reflect that. Now, I know they did cut these down further, and there was actual RX550 chips that were also called the 460D and things like that, and there's lots of confusion with the names or whatever. Chances are, if you're just buying an RX460 that looks like this or looks fancy, you're going to be getting these specifications you see here. When it comes to the pricing on these, it really is hard to gauge how much people are paying for them. Since I did my video on the actual PC this came in, CEX have actually reduced their price on these down to £20, and that comes with a 5-year warranty, so it's not the worst value thing there if you just want a low-powered graphics card that can do some gaming, because keep in mind, I've already done the benchmarks and the performance on this little card, well, it's still rather impressive today. Over on the eBay side of things, they're selling anywhere from £8.50 all the way up to £35, depending on what one you're buying. Lots of the more expensive ones seem to come with fancy coolers they really don't need, but you're going to be getting very similar performance across the board. The problem is they tend to stray into that RX480 and RX580 territory, where you're getting a much better graphics card than this, and even then, those are very power efficient if you undervolt them. I've not really come across many systems that wouldn't be able to power an RX480, leaving this RX460 in a bit of a redundant place in the market. But let me try and put it to you this way. What if you just want to go out and you want to buy an RX460 graphics card, because I noticed that in some markets it's one of the only graphics cards you can buy. For example, if you need to order a graphics card off AliExpress or somewhere like that, you want something with modern API support and it needs to run on your, I don't know, 15-year-old FSP group power supply. This is for those people that really haven't got any other choice than to buy the RX460, because I know already a lot of people in the comments are going to be saying, just buy the RX480, just buy the RX580. Yes, that's a very good point, and no one's going to be arguing with that point. But if you can get an RX460 for those cheap prices like I've seen them go for, I mean, if you got one for £8.50 like I've just seen on eBay, then that's a bargain. But if you're spending 20 to 30 quid on this, well, you're certainly paying on the higher end of the spectrum. But anyway, that's enough for talking about the pricing, that's enough about talking about the RX460. Is this card any good when we throw it up into the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with normal textures and a few of the other settings turned up to high, so a few like shadows and lighting. We also had HBAO enabled, and this was in the 1080p resolution. Now, this was actually a pretty good start for the RX460, and it's pretty much one of the main things it's got going for it. Because it had excellent API support, these newer titles like GTA 5 Enhanced Edition using DirectX 12 tend to run perfectly fine. Now, we were going slightly over the 2GB VRAM limit, which I know some people will be shouting about, but you've got to remember GTA 5, Red Dead and a lot of Rage Engine games tend to be a tad too pessimistic when it comes to thinking how much VRAM they're actually going to use. Because even with these higher settings on a 2GB RX460, we were seeing nearly a fluid 60 FPS. and when I wasn't plugged into the capture card, this monitor is FreeSync enabled, which is also a point the RX460's got going through it, because it looked very smooth all the while you have that FreeSync enabled. Moving back to the legacy version, and you've pretty much got your answer into why these were in so many systems and are now just appearing like cockroaches on the market. They were able to run the most popular title of their release year absolutely fine with high and very high settings with AMD's CHS shadows enabled at nearly a perfect 60 FPS. Turning down a few of these options and you would likely see a perfectly locked 60 FPS, but really I don't like turning off my AMD CHS shadows because they do actually look really good in GTA 5 the legacy version. Now the performance here was pretty much bang on where it was with the enhanced edition, so it doesn't matter whether you want to play legacy or enhanced, you're pretty much going to be seeing bang on the same frame rate. The only difference here with the legacy version is you're able to manage the high textures, which you just can't in the enhanced edition. Whether or not you can really notice, well, that's up to you. Moving over onto the world of GTA Online, and it should really come as no surprise that a lot of these Polaris cards don't really have issues when it comes to the optimization and the utilization of their cards when they are in large 16+ player lobbies. Now you've got to remember this game has major optimization problems over 16 players because the netcode just crumbles into abysmalness and it's just a mess. But either way here we did see a slight performance hit to the average and a bit more of a major performance hit to the 1% lows, now down to 44 FPS, but that didn't detract from the fact that it is still fully playable in a maxed out lobby. In smaller lobbies though, it was actually easier to run than single player and you'd be seeing over 60 FPS with the same set of settings. So either way, whether you're playing in maxed out full lobbies or just with your friends in a closed lobby, the RX460 is once again proving that it was a great card for games of its era. Now BeamNG, I really thought we'd be off to a good start being able to utilise the Vulkan renderer options, because on a lot of these AMD cards I've tested, they really do get a slight increase in performance and stability from running Vulkan. But unfortunately on the RX460 here, maybe it's just the version I'm testing and maybe it was the drivers I was on, but there was no increase to the performance by using Vulkan. In fact, it pretty much halved our frame rate. So we were stuck here using low and medium settings in DirectX 11, but still in a 1080p resolution. And we saw 42 FPS on average, with a rather stable frame rate with 1% lows down to 39 FPS. Simpler maps and scenarios would be well over 60 FPS with these settings, and you could even crank them up higher in simpler situations. But for the sake of our benchmark and the fact we always run the jungle map unless it can't run it, well, it goes to show that you can at least handle BeamNG in some of its most intensive situations. Now, Counter-Strike 2, maybe I went into this expecting slightly better performance, but the built-in workshop benchmark map is rather intensive in this game with lots of smokes and effects going on, which really did hammer home on the RX460, as that is where we were seeing our lowest possible frame rate. We saw 87 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 62 FPS using the competitive settings in 1080p. Now, when you actually went in-game, you'd be seeing over 100 FPS a lot of the time, but if the footage here does look slightly choppy, well, I had to actually go and change the battery and the mouse that I'm using because for the first time ever it actually did run out of power. So the stuttering there is nothing to do with the graphics card, it's due to my wireless mouse running down in power. So Counter-Strike 2 fully playable and runs better in game than the workshop benchmark would lead you to believe. With Cyberpunk 2077, I didn't go into this with much hope because trying to run this on 2GB VRAM cards, at least the ones I've tested previously, really do struggle. When I tested AMD's Tonga series with the R9285, it really just couldn't manage this game at all because of the 2GB of VRAM. Yet with a 3GB card that's older like the HD 7970, we saw it work fine. So why is it actually running okay on a 2GB RX460? Well, during the built-in benchmark we saw 37 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 27 FPS, admittedly with low settings in 720p, but the game still does look rather good with these settings. There was no need for FSR or anything like that, as the actual overhead hurt the performance more than just leaving it disabled, and we even managed to do some gameplay benchmarking, albeit we did have to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS to try and make the game playable, as our 1% lows remained the same, but the average just went all over the place as the graphics card was trying to do far too much. So Cyberpunk is surprisingly playable as long as you cap the frame rate and keep to low settings in 720p, and this is on a low-end 2GB card from AMD. Mount & Blade Bannerlord immediately configured itself for a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, so I just left it as is because when it comes to the auto detection feature on any game I've tested, Mount & Blade Bannerlord seems to always know what settings it should run at, and it made no mistake here with the game looking and running fantastic with these settings in 1080p with 42 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 31 FPS. Now given how reminiscent this is of the late game, it's well worth keeping in mind that for most of the early to mid game you'll be seeing over 60 FPS with these same set of settings. If you are desperate to see over 60 FPS, you can drop the game fully back to a mixture of low and medium settings, and you'll be seeing anywhere from 60 to 80 FPS through the same benchmark. So Mount & Blade Bannerlord fully playable, and you can at least enjoy some eye candy with it as well. Baldur's Gate 3 was a bit of a weird one to eventually tweak it down to actually being playable, as the game defaulted to ultra settings in 1080p, and you can imagine how that went. With a mixture of low and medium settings though in 720p, as we needed to drop that resolution thanks to that 2GB of VRAM, we did see the game was playable with 40 FPS and 1% lows down to 32 FPS. Once again, it seemed weirdly more stable on DirectX 11 than it was over on Vulkan, which isn't usually the case with this game, but I'd imagine it's something to do with probably the shaders being compiled and also the fact this is a low frame buffer card. Well, 2 gigs of VRAM just really isn't a lot today. It's a shame to be saying that because it is the VRAM that's proving to be a limit on this weird little low-end display adapter. You wouldn't think it, would you? 2 gigs being too little for an RX460, but it just shows how games have grown. Either way, Baldur's Gate 3 was playable, but DirectX 11 low and medium settings 720p is your best bet for playing it. Now, can it run Oblivion Remastered? Well, with low settings in 360p, we saw 23 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 17 FPS. Unfortunately, Unreal Engine 5, at least those titles that are out there that don't tend to come with any optimizations whatsoever, will just chew through these older cards and mark the end of the line for them. Much as they've done for a lot of older cards, even ones with more memory than this, they just mark an ending point where they just aren't going to be playable and you can't tweak them down to make them playable. Frankly, it looked fairly awful and it was fairly stable in some places. In fact, when you're actually inside an area like caves and in some small towns and cities and buildings, you would see a locked 30 FPS because we had to cap the frame rate just to try and keep the game somewhat playable and not as stuttery. So Oblivion Remastered is not fantastic, but it also proves us a bit of the great filter here. There are graphics cards that will run this and be fine for a few more years, and there's some graphics cards like the RX460 where this marks the end point of them being useful in the world of AAA, and unfortunately for the RX460, that is now. Turning things back a little bit to the world of Black Mesa, which once again is a gorgeous but very intensive Source Engine 1 based title, where with a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, we saw 76 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 58 FPS. Now this is remarkably commendable given that this is actually a very intensive game to run, and also goes to show because the last few times we've tested this, Black Mesa actually achieves a very similar frame rate to Counter-Strike 2 in a lot of instances, so it's a pretty good benchmark for computers that I've got that can't actually launch Counter-Strike 2. Either way, I'm on a little bit of a tangent there, but that's besides the point. Black Mesa runs fine, which therefore means that all previous Source games will work completely fine as well. Hitman 3, when we went through the automated setup, decided it wanted to run with low textures and some of the effects and lighting detail turned up to a mixture of medium and high. So in 1080p with the settings it selected for us, we saw 35 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 29 FPS. Once again, it refused to actually launch the benchmark map, so we had to go in-game to test the performance, where we saw it pretty much stick to anything slightly over 30 FPS no matter what you were doing. There were certain instances where lighting was rather intense and there was lots of reflections going on, and it would drop you down to slightly south of 30 FPS, but never enough to not be playable. So Hitman 3 does work remarkably well on the RX460. I still have absolutely no clue how to play Pal World, but we are benchmarking it due to popular request. Now, this is the type of game that lots of people with an RX460, or those that are looking at buying the RX460, will probably be wanting to run because, I don't know, maybe it's a game they play with their friends or something like that. But during my brief time actually playing it and actually trying to get some clue of what I'm meant to be doing in this title, we saw 36 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 27 FPS. We were at least able to keep a 1080p resolution, which is quite nice price for a modern title, and also one that is running Unreal Engine 5. Now unfortunately we couldn't go any higher than low settings, so this would bring you down to a pretty much abysmal frame rate, but dropping the resolution didn't really help bring the frame rate up much either, so this is pretty much the best experience you're going to be getting in Palworld. City Skylines 2 does actually have a slightly nicer aesthetic than the original, in terms of it's actually less grey and drab. It's still not quite up to the levels of SimCity 2013 in terms of actually looking like a game I want to play, but with a frame rate and settings like this, I wouldn't really recommend it. Now, being a city builder, even with the lowest settings in 720p, it is playable with that 24 FPS average, but really just play the original or play SimCity or just play any other city builder, because this game is far too intensive for the 2GB of VRAM on the RX460. There were certain points where our utilization on the card dropped because the game was requesting too much VRAM even with these awful settings. So once again, 2GB of VRAM is not enough on an RX460, which is just astonishing to say. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, this is actually quite a good test for the RX460 because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that will be looking at buying this graphics card if they can get one cheap that want to play a lot of classic titles. And I can pretty much just say for all titles from before it came out, you're looking at a very similar experience to Crysis, where you're talking ultra settings in 1080p and you're going to be seeing anywhere from 50 to 70 FPS depending on what's happening on screen. So Crysis is a good test to just show you that for older titles, even the really intensive DirectX 10 ones like Crysis, which aren't particularly well optimized, they're going to run perfectly fine on the RX460 because it is a powerful architecture that is admittedly cut down. But when you're dealing with these older titles that aren't requesting oodles of VRAM, it's still quite a powerful card. So Crysis will run fine, but it also means all your older titles like Fallout, Skyrim, things like that will also work perfect on the card as well. So how is the performance of the RX460? Well, honestly, I was pretty blown away by how well it performed. It's got to be said that those Polaris enhancements do definitely carry it through some titles, because when you look at, Cyberpunk shouldn't be playable on this graphics card. I've never tested a graphics card with 2GB of VRAM that can actually play this game. But it goes to show that the RX460, you're not using mods, you're not using configuration tweaks, you're purely setting the game to its lowest options, capping the frame rate at 30 FPS, and you can go and cause havoc in the city and it's still going to be playable. It's only when you start getting into those latest and greatest titles that you can't scale down whatsoever, like, City Skylines 2, Oblivion Remastered, they just weren't playable on the card, not because it doesn't have the raw horsepower, because you can't tweak these games down low enough, at least not in a way that makes any tangible benefit to the performance. But the thing is, for a lot of those most popular titles out there, the RX460 is still chugging along. Counter-Strike 2 works fine, GTA 5 working fine, BeamNG working fine, Bannerlord fine, Baldur's Gate 3 fine, Palworld, even that, runs on this graphics card. And if you can pick one up like I've seen sell for £8, that's a bargain. But I very rarely see them go for that price, which is where this gets controversial, because as much as that is good performance, for the money that you're going to spend for one of these on average, the RX480 trumps it completely, because you see this suddenly all shift up into being playable, whereas it's only those optimized titles that are. So it's an interesting one. Really, it makes me want to get a 4GB version and just see how much this card was limited by 2GB of VRAM, because it shouldn't be. 2GB seems more than ample for a card of this caliber. But there are games out there that are utilizing more VRAM than they actually need than the graphics card itself, if that makes any sense. Either way, the point is weird. It's a weird place of the market, and it's weird how games are utilizing this card now. And you know what, I did think, why don't we test the modded drivers? Because it's not like we're going to be testing the RX460 again, at least not in its 2GB form, for probably a good few years now. We've got the video done, it's out of the way, there's nothing more to worry about. But what if there is a tangible increase to running the modified Nemez drivers on these graphics cards? I didn't see anywhere around the RX480 or even the RX580 that I tried that was half broken. There was no real performance increase to running them. But here on the RX460, well, it took me a little while to go through the drivers, enable all the enhancements and get them all set up and working, and when eventually you do, it does show the card as an RX560X, which apparently is a card that does exist. But when we had them all set up and working, there was some notable increases in performance in certain titles, the main one being Counter-Strike 2, which saw a major increase in both our average FPS and the 1% lows. Now of course this makes sense, because for those popular titles that are out there, you of course are going to want to be able to play those competitive titles on the lower end cards that are available to you, so it makes sense that one of the main substantial increases was in Counter-Strike 2. Across the board, it was either no change or maybe a slight increase. Oblivion Remastered saw a slight increase in performance, Baldur's Gate 3 saw a slight increase, Pal World as well saw a slight increase and was more stable to run, but most games tended to run pretty much on par with their Windows standard drivers in comparison. In fact, most new titles either ran better or about the same. It's only when you start looking at older games like, for example, Crysis, where you see a substantial performance hit by using the modified drivers. So it's got to be said, really, if you're playing something like Counter-Strike, these drivers are probably pretty good for you. Otherwise, the Windows ones, they're pretty solid as well. So there are advantages to the modded drivers on these lower end cards, but mostly, if you're not playing Counter-Strike, you're not going to notice any performance change whatsoever. So what else is there we can really say about the RX460? We've checked its gaming performance, we've checked its modded driver performance to see if there was any increase. I suppose there's a few other things we can talk about, like we can use the AMD VC engine that's built in, which does work surprisingly well and does support HEVC apparently when I went into OBS, so we're able to do a little bit of recording, and it does make sense as a media center card because they're cheap, they're plentifully available, and they will use very little power. You can undervolt these and they become exceptionally power efficient, so AMD VC works completely fine on my range of testing. I did also do a little bit of testing of thermals and power consumption. So in terms of thermals, when it's running standard and cleaned, so it's actually running fresh thermal paste, you're talking a card that maxes out about 68 to 70 degrees, and then of course when you start overclocking them and putting a full load on them, this increases to around 75 to 76. Now when it comes to RX460 coolers, this is probably the worst one you're going to come across, as it's nothing more than a slab of aluminium whacked on top of the card. It doesn't offer VRAM cooling or anything of the sorts. This is as basic as it gets, so they really don't chuck out much heat as long as they are cleaned and have fresh thermal paste. When it comes to power consumption, well, with an undervolt I was able to get it so the card is operable at the stock clocks, which is the default OEM ones that are lower, and it used just a tad north of 30 watts. Running fully overclocked and pumped up to the 9s, it uses slightly over 50 watts, so it's never a power-hungry card, which is something that Polaris was good at. It was very good at power efficiency, especially when you undervolt it. And really, is there any more to say than that? So the RX460. And I do have some interesting thoughts, because I doubt we ever would have taken the time to look at the RX460 given its weird price point, unless I got one that was bundled into a Core 2 Duo system, because lots of people bought them at the time to do this exact thing. You got an old Core 2 Duo, Core 2 Quad, maybe a Sandy Bridge system, you whacked in an RX460 and suddenly you had a gaming PC. And from the performance you've seen where it does work, well, you had a pretty good gaming PC. You went from something that couldn't play games to, oh wow, you're playing GTA 5 with the highest settings and the fancy shadows turned on, which is what the graphics card was always good at. But it does seem like with modern games requiring just tons of VRAM that it doesn't even seem like they should need, well, the RX460's hit the brick wall. It doesn't go any further than titles like City Skylines 2 or Oblivion Remastered, unless they are particularly well optimized. So it's a bit of a sad note, because the RX460 has struggled to find its purpose. In fact, it lost its purpose. Having not dropped into bargain bin territory with people still asking far too much money for these cards, you are better off buying an RX480, and if you are worried about power consumption, just undervolt it, and you can get very similar power requirements to this out of it, and you're not going to have to worry about losing much performance because they will undervolt well. You'll still get better performance than this at a similar price point. So it's a bit of a weird one, isn't it? Because it's a good graphics card, but please only buy one if you find it cheap enough. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you found this at least informative, and good night.